Thank you so much. And it looks like the mic is working. Everyone can hear me okay? Yes? Great. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us at today's session. You all get some extra brownie points for being here right after a lunch hour, so thank you very much for being here and choosing our session. Today's session is going to be a little bit of a three-parter, just giving you a little bit of the format. So we're going to share a little bit about perspectives from both librarians and publishers about open access and open access policies. We're going to do that in three parts. So the first part is going to be a little bit of an introduction. We'll do those formal introductions in just a moment. We'll share some thoughts on publishers and how librarians and publishers collaborate, information about the current environment from the European context, as well as here in the United States with the OSTP memo. We'll talk a little bit about what that is, just framing some of today's panel discussion as well as the Q&A for all of you. And then we'll move into the second part where our panelists will share a little bit of their thoughts and perspectives on some of the questions that we've prepared today. And then the third part, we hope that you will want to participate in this. This will be a time for questions and answers and additional participation and discussion on anything we didn't get to during part two. During this time, you can ask those questions live. Our lovely facilitator did mention that you can use the microphone here live. You can also use the Q&A function that's on the Whova app. So if you do want to do that, you're welcome to as well. I do want to introduce Helena at this time. Helena, wave to everybody. Helena is going to help monitor the Q&A and also potentially help with some of the questions here live in the session. I'm going to be doing a little bit of the moderating and facilitating during this session. I'll introduce myself shortly. And then just a few notes of housekeeping. We are not experts on all things open access. And so we welcome any of your thoughts, perspectives, and feedback from your experience. So we do hope you'll take this time to share those with us throughout today's discussion. And then lastly, the views that are expressed in today's panel are our own, and they do not necessarily reflect the organizations for which we work. So with that, we'll start with some introductions. Since I'm already speaking, I will go ahead and start first. My name is Sarah Norris. I am the Scholarly Communication Librarian at the University of Central Florida. If you're not familiar with UCF, we are one of the largest public universities in the United States. We have about 70,000 FTE, just a few students, and we are a research institution. We have a strong focus on STEM, but we do have a very heavy research industry as well. So we partner with NASA and many other organizations in Central Florida. Many people assume because we are a large-scale institution that we are deeply embedded in all things open. And while that is true, one of the perspectives that I want to share today is a large institution who you might think is really heavily involved, but may not have as much infrastructure or organization or funding, which I'm sure many of you can relate to facilitate many formal open access endeavors. So with that, we do not have an open access policy or mandate, but we do have, of course, many researchers who are heavily active in open access publications. We do have an institutional repository, but there is not a required deposit for that. So I would say on the whole, it's active, but maybe not as robust as my colleague at UC Davis, but we do have that available. The library itself, because of some of our funding structures, is a little bit more limited in our agreements that we participate in that focus on open access. So we do have a small and select group of read and publish agreements that we participate in, and a few subscribe to open, and we can talk a little bit more about that. The library's also been really active in trying to develop as much support as we can on campus. So we helped develop an APC fund for our graduate students and postdocs through our College of Graduate Studies, which has been a really great success, and we hope to model that with faculty as well. In my role as Scholarly Communication Librarian, a lot of what I do, and probably much of what many of you do, is education and outreach and support. So lots of questions about article processing charges, helping shift some of that culture on campus, workshops, lots and lots of workshops, copyright education and information, and a high level of collaboration with our campus partners. So that's a little bit about me. I'm going to take a little bit of a breath and introduce my colleagues. And first up is Michael from UC Davis.
Okay, yes, so hello everyone. Thanks for coming. My name is Michael Ladisch. I'm the Scholarly Communications Officer at University of California, Davis. Davis is, if you don't know, it's located in the Central Valley of California, right half an hour away from the capital, Sacramento. We are a campus that is focused and specialized and very good in anything agriculture, veterinary medicine, health science, and so on. But of course, we have almost a full portfolio of disciplines on our campus. We are part of the University of California system, which is composed of 10 campuses and 2 national laboratories. The libraries, the campus libraries, work very, very closely together. So we are a poster child within our system for good collaboration between the campuses. We have sort of a consortium, and we have a unit that's called the California Digital Library, which is a unit that manages and negotiates purchases that is available for all 10 campuses, as well as subscriptions, and you might have heard this, transformative open access agreements. And so in my role, I work very closely with my dear colleagues at the CDL to help authors to understand these agreements, help with troubleshooting, be the contact person and the liaison for that. In addition to this, we have on our campus additional open access support available for books as well as for journals. Again, I'm the person who's doing this. So it's a scholarly communications program. It's a program of one. I always call myself the department of one. Le programme c'est moi. Yeah, that's pretty much what I can say about myself right now, and I hand it over to Frank.
Check. Yeah, Frank is my name. I'm a Global Development Manager at Frontiers. Frontiers is a fully open access publisher. Its mission is to make all science open. It's actually the third most cited publisher, the 6th largest publisher, and is second biggest the second largest open access publisher, fully open access publisher. I'm working in the institutional partnerships program, which is about collaborating with institutions and funders and consortia. We cover over 700 institutions by now, and we actually have a goal to have all articles covered by that institutional partnerships program in the next 5 years. And we believe that part of achieving that is innovating also in terms of the institutional partnerships models we offer. And that's what I'm actually focusing on, Helena as well, and that's why I'm sitting here.
My name is Nick Newcomer. I'm the Vice President of Sales and Marketing at IGI Global. IGI Global is a U.S. publisher based out of Hershey, Pennsylvania, focusing on the areas of business, STM, and education. We were founded in 1988. On the premises of publishing journals and segued into books. Right now, we are one of the few publishers that have made the full transition from standard publishing to fully open access. That actually makes us one of the world's largest open access publishers now because we've transitioned nearly 200 journals over to OA. I was one of the key strategists in the company that worked through those processes, and we'll close out this section of the panel and give you guys a glimpse into the journey of all the collaborations that we had taken with the libraries to get to where we are today.
Great. So now that you all know a little bit about us, we're going to do just about a 1-minute statement sharing our thoughts and perspectives on how publishers and librarians collaborate. So I'll go ahead and start us off. So from my perspective, and something that we've all talked as panelists, is a real key component is the feedback and discussion loop between those publishers and librarians, right? Sharing what works, what doesn't, what the needs are of a specific institution, because we're all unique. We all have really specific needs, different cultures within our institution. I also think the publishing culture broadly is something that we're really going to want to think about. If you work in an academic space, promotion and tenure is real, and that really does impact the perspectives on researchers and how they want to publish in certain kinds of publications, right? So that is something that we also have to consider and discuss as colleagues. Compliance, of course, especially with these policies, is going to be critical. And then I think just wrapping up, and I'll turn it over to my next colleague, but meeting libraries where they are. I think that's a huge piece for publishers, understanding the needs of the particular research institution or institution broadly, understanding that funding challenges are really real, right? And it's not that we don't want to participate in something, but that we may not have the funding structure to be able to do that. So thinking creatively, thinking outside of the box is important. Understanding the needs of the researchers. That's another conversation that we had before giving this presentation today, is sometimes we forget about the researcher aspect, right? They have their research, they want things to be easy. They don't want things to be complicated. And so I think thinking about that voice as a stakeholder in this conversation is really important. And then lastly, discussions of diversity, equity, inclusion, and access should always be at the fore, especially with something like an open movement where that should be foundational, I think is really critical. So I'll turn it over to Michael to share any thoughts he might have.
Yes, thank you. Well, there's much I could just repeat what Sarah just said. But what I like really here in Charleston is to see the variety of models that have been developed and are being experimented with. And I think we need this. We need a big variety of ideas and how we go forward to this. We need different publishers that we work with. We need a sort of a bibliodiversity here, and again, the no one-size-fits-all applies here. So we need to keep in mind disciplinary differences in publishing. We need to keep in mind institutional differences for agreements and contracts and whatever we do. And of course, also publisher differences. So no publisher is like the other. Wiley is different from IGI Global, and IGI Global is different from University of California Press, and this publisher is different from the Association of Field Ornithologists that published just one journal and just flipped to open access. So that's a really good example. And yeah, so this is certainly important to keep in mind when we collaborate, when we work with publishers. And one thing that I always want to point out is sustainability. So we really need to put under the microscope every new model, every new development that we do, and try to find out how does it look like in 5 years or in 6 years? Is it still around, or is it mushroomed and developed in this big thing, or is it merged with something else? So we need to be careful where we invest our resources and make sure that it is still around in 5 years, and it's something that is not just an idea that came up today and disappears tomorrow, maybe. So this was something that Frank.
Great. And Frank, did you want to share your thoughts as well?
About collaboration between librarians and publishers?
Yes.
Yeah, I just want to make it very short. So I think the best example is obviously from my experiences is our institutional partnerships program, where we have like a multitude of like interfaces with librarians and work with them at different stages and under different frameworks and models. Yeah. So in terms of stages, for example, we have a whole dedicated team supporting and working with these 700 plus institutions, which is very much valued by many librarians. In terms of models, it is of course the maturity of these partnerships under very well proven, we call that central invoicing partnerships, but we also have pilot partnerships. So we develop new models, as I mentioned earlier. This is a particular type of interaction and types of collaboration. And we also have a new-ish kind of co-creation framework where we deliberately have set up a whole range of formats where we get this feedback loop Sarah mentioned, like focus groups and expert interviews and service and so forth.
Thank you, everybody. So now we're going to wrap up a little bit of our section before we go into section number 2, and Michael's going to talk a little bit about policy and the OSTP memo.
Well, just very briefly, because I think everyone is familiar with the OSTP memo, at least heard about it. But we also, I want to mention that at the University of California, we have an open access policy that is, well, we actually have two. We actually have more than two, but two main ones. So one is was created, established by the academic senate. So it's faculty-driven, it's researcher-driven. It's not something that was imposed by the administration. You gotta do this now. And the academic senate open access policy was then followed by a presidential open access policy, which then was more something from above, though that covers everybody else who's not academic senate faculty. And under this policy, authors, UC affiliated authors, are required to claim their publications in a publication management system, and then to deposit the final manuscript, the final author manuscript, or a link to the open access publication if it was published open access. Compliance is another issue that I don't want to discuss here. No questions about, please. But the OSTP memo, so the Office of Science and Technology Policy from the White House issued this guidance on public policy, and here's the difference between open access and public policy. In 2022, it follows an earlier memo that, as you all know, required publications funded by NIH or NSF to be made available publicly after 1 year. This new memo now extends this, goes further, requires grantees from federal grants, to make their publications publicly available immediately at publication time. It also covers all federal agencies. The previous one was only covering big agencies that had more than 100, I think 100 million dollars in research expenditures. And it also includes research data. This is an area that we won't discuss, or we don't discuss, because then we get another rabbit hole. We don't have time to. It also allows the federal agencies to grant funding for open access publication. So applicants for federal grants can budget for a publication cost, for open access publication cost. However, as you, if you look at the news once in a while, you realize Congress is not in the best place currently. There's no budget yet, so we don't know anything about how this will play out. But even worse, the Appropriations Subcommittee on Commerce, Justice, and Science in the US House said they want to defund the OSTP memo. So explicitly saying no money for open access under the OSTP memo. This is, of course, only a proposal, and we will see where it goes to. But there is, of course, a lot of concern that in budget negotiations, this is like a small thing, relatively speaking, very important for all of us here, but a relatively small thing in the big picture, in the big federal budget, and that this might be sort of sacrificed for the sake of getting more important items in a budget approved. So we will see where it goes. It is not the death of the OSTP memo, because the OSTP memo doesn't say open access publishing, only public access. So authors can still provide public access to the final version of their final, not the final version, the final manuscript of their publication. But it is certainly would be a bump in the system. So we will cross our fingers, hope. Okay.
Thank you, Michael. And then Frank's going to talk a little bit about the current environment, including policy context, the European ecosystem, as well as talk a little bit about publishing models.
Yep, just a few minutes. Before I go to Europe, actually, I just coincidentally this morning saw a second time some source saying that in Asia there is also expected by experts to be some sort of policy coming following OSTP, following and also European developments. And obviously Asia is actually bigger than both the US as well as Europe. But in Europe, in terms of policy generally, or at least like with perhaps a delay of 7 years or so, there has always been like a more focus on gold open access or mixed mandates. Yeah, it was always more allowed to go this route, and that is accompanied with also separate funds. Unlike the US, there are funds made available by funders and governments separate from grant funds. One policy, the Coalition S policy, is not limited to Europe, of course, but often associated with it is going beyond that. It is immediate open access full stop. So that's kind of a step further. And it also goes yet another step further in terms of that it tries to implement also a, you could call it a no hybrid policy. This came about in around 2018-19. There were like discussions at the time. It's a kind of a standoff with traditional publishers, and it had been agreed to a compromise basically. And now we are 5 years later. At the end of 2024, this will now kick in. So basically, these influential funders won't support articles in hybrid journals anymore, even if they are part of transformative agreements. And some of these developments are also reflected in national open access strategies, for example, in Sweden. And another highlight, very quickly, it's not strictly speaking a binding policy, but there has been a conclusion by the EU Council, which also states that immediate open access ought to be the default for science publishing. So it's a quite strong signal because it basically reflects the position of all member states. But also in this policy, it goes beyond that immediate access criterion, in that it states actually a whole range of new criteria, such as equity, which is also mentioned in the OSTP, sustainability, transparency, as well as, for example, fees must not be or should not be author-facing. We were planning to talk about models, but I think we are a bit over time, so I just very quickly say, obviously, we talk about closed or toll access, or sometimes called subscriptions, green, gold, hybrid, diamond. I'm not going into that now, but what I think is worth saying is that within the gold category, you could roughly also differentiate between often now called transformative agreements. In the UK, they call it transitional agreements, or it's read and publish and read agreements, which is kind of a very big but different category to fully open access agreements, something, for example, Frontiers or Plus, for example. Thus, and within both of these categories, you can also differentiate between uncapped, I heard yesterday that term, or unlimited models, or what I think is now the case in Germany with Elsevier, something which is not like that, where you still kind of count, which is still unit-based, if you want to use that term. And of course, there's a whole host of new models emerging. Subscribe to Open was mentioned already, multi-pair, and other equity models.
Thanks, Frank. Yeah, I think as you're illustrating, it's complicated. These things are changing quickly. So we hope that today's conversation is a good conversation starter in this topic. And I'm going to turn it over to Nick. Nick is going to talk a little bit about IGI Global's journey from standard publisher to open access journals.
Yeah, thank you, Frank and Michael. Gave a great overview of the policies, and I'm going to provide that journey that IGI Global took to ensure that we're meeting these mandates and the expectation. It first started for us in 2017 when the conversation of open access, became more relevant. We quickly shifted our journals into a hybrid model, and then immediately started offering read and publish options. Those options were bound to whether a book collection or e-journal collections was required, and we would take that fund and apply that to APC funding for the library's faculty. We use that as a data set to see what the conversations would be like with the libraries and to determine what our path was to take every one of our 200 journals and shift them into open access. In 2021, we started that process by taking 30 of our journals, including some with impact, and shifting them into full gold open access. 2022, an additional 30, and then this year, in 2023, at the beginning, we shifted everything over because the numbers showed us that it was plausible. During that time, we did utilize a kind of watered down version of subscribe to open. We didn't set any thresholds. We found it was going to be too difficult to manage both the open access and having the subscriptions. So we basically just asked the librarians for support, and if they would like to continue with their quote unquote subscription, that we would just open everything up. During that process, year over year, we would take anything that we earned on the APCs and deduct that from what the subscription cost would be the previous or that next year. We're going to exclude that moving forward because we feel that our open access journals are sustainable at this point. So we're not going to be looking for any type of assistance outside of what we're currently offering. And I know Frank just touched on it a little bit, which is a pure open access agreement where the libraries can fund their faculty's publishing by acquiring APC funding up front at discounted rates and then using those funds whenever the content is accepted into the journal. My question is, and I'm going fast for the sake of time, but what I wanted to pose here was, what does it mean now that a publisher has transitioned? Where are those conversations now? Everything that I hear is still kind of revolving around those transition options, the subscribe to open, but what happens to the publishers when that transformation has actually happened?
A lot of thought for discussion. Thank you, Nick. So we're going to move into part two. Part two is going to be panel discussion for some questions that we prepared. We are also going to give a little bit of time after each question for some participation from you all. We'll take one or two questions if there are any, and we'll let you know at that time. As our facilitator mentioned, if you do have a question or feedback you want to share at that time, we do ask that you come to the mic, or Helena will also have a roving mic as well we can bring through. So the first question to start us off is, how do libraries view the rapid transition to open access, and what do they perceive are the implications for library publisher agreements? So this could be anything like the read and publish, subscribe to open. Thoughts and perspectives from you all.
Okay, so it goes to libraries, so it gets one of us.
That's you.
Okay.
And me.
Yeah, so open access came a long way, and open access is mainstream now. I can probably safely say that. When I started my career in a library, open access was nowhere around, but then it's such a long time. We used floppy disk back then anyway. So yes, and it has implications for negotiations and for contracts that we do with publishers. So subscription still around. We need subscriptions in order to provide access to material that our researchers need and the students and everyone else. But open access plays a much bigger role. And for legacy publishers that traditionally published under the subscription model and now slowly or sometimes faster, moving to open access, it's relatively easy. Oh, sorry. It's relatively easy. We can negotiate agreements and contracts that include support for open access publishing. It's a little bit more difficult for publishers that are native open access, that we don't have subscription funds to repurpose to support open access publishing. But in any case, there's no way around to find ways to support authors, because what I hear daily from faculty, from researchers, from graduate students, I want to publish my publication in open access. I've just been accepted. How can you support me with my open access publication? So the motivation is different. Some people just follow the crowd because they hear open access, so yeah, I have to do this as well. Other people are very, very consciously choosing open access because they know what the benefits are. My favorite examples are people in environmental science who want to have an impact outside of academia. We have people who need to publish, I think they need to publish open access because of funder requirements or other requirements, policies, and so on. So we really, as libraries, we have to adjust there, and we do. And we have to repurpose our money. We have to use our budget in order to facilitate that move. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. And I think you hit a lot of the things that I would say as well. I think about it really pragmatically, like it adds more complexity and it also impacts our budget, right? Those are the two things that are going to immediately come to mind. How do we now think about the open access agreements within the other things that we have, our subscriptions? How do we decide what becomes open, what doesn't? Is it budgetarily feasible? Is it relatively flat? And I say flat or cost neutral because that may not technically be cost neutral. And yet to us, it may feel cost neutral because it's not increasing our budget. What gets dropped, what doesn't? And also the culture of our institution. Do we have an institution where there is a mandate? And so you may want to consider that even more highly in your decision-making process. So to me, it adds more complexity, it's important, and then the budget piece is always going to be a huge consideration that I'm not sure that we've really figured out. I think that's going to be a key piece for us as libraries. How do we add that piece to our budgets and make it so that our ever-dwindling budgets still can get the things that we need for our researchers? Any thoughts and perspectives from any of you in the audience? We have a little bit of time to take maybe one or two questions or comments. Yes. We've got one right up here in front. Hi.
I'm from Cornell University, and I'm curious how the publishers come up with what the best APC fee is. I've seen a range from $1,500 to $4,500 per article, and I'm just curious how they calculate that figure.
That's a great question, and I will turn that to our publisher colleagues.
I do think that your range is a little low. Some of those APCs go much higher than that, up into above $10,000. I know for IGI Global, our average is $2,500, with the highest being the journals that obviously have impact in the Web of Science. Publishing is not cheap. It's not. There are a lot of integrations that we have to make with third parties. You have your development, you have your production, you have even the distribution of content. What we try to do at IGI Global is just come up with a fair price, based on the average of what we're seeing with the competitive ecosystem. But again, I think that anywhere from $1,500 to $4,000, it's anywhere from $1,500 up to like $14,000 is really where you're seeing that range.
Yeah, and maybe just adding, I mean, I totally agree. That's very similar with Frontiers. The average APC, I'm not sure, maybe is around that area, a bit lower maybe. But what we have is we price differentiate across different article types and also different journals, journal categories, which is based on the disciplines and maturity and other criteria. So actually we have a price spectrum from $450 going to $3,200 or something like this, or something in this area, which is also an attempt to address to some extent equity or be more inclusive.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions or comments? All right, we'll go ahead and move on to the the next question for our panel. So this question is, what role will researcher or grant funders, and in this case it could be something like the NIH or NSF here in the US or Wellcome Trust in the UK, what role do they play in supporting researchers in open access publishing in the next 3 to 5 years?
Yeah, this goes back to what I said before, the OSTP memo. So the research funders will play a big role in open access publishing funding, if they can, if they have the budget. So some funders, like the Bill Gates Foundation, Wellcome Trust, they have their own budget and they fund for open access publishing. Federal funding agencies, again, we will see. We hope that they will play a big role in funding open access publishing. But again, their goal is to make federally funded research publicly available. So it doesn't mean necessarily the gold route, open access publishing. It could be the green route as well. But they play a big role in pushing open access and public access and making research available. They will play a big role and still, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, Michael, that many of the grant funding agencies simply require some sort of deposit. And that could be green open access, which is just self-archiving in an institutional repository in some way. And yet that may not be the best model going forward. Or can the funding agencies provide better funding structure so that the researcher can deposit it in other places that might be more higher impact, that might have more of the spirit of the intent of the policy than just doing the self-archiving role. So I think that would be something that, from my personal perspective, I would love to see the grant funding agencies employ more fully, is incorporating the funding structure if possible, so that the onus isn't just on the researcher themselves individually or the institution for which they are affiliated or the library or some other space that might have funding to assist.
Yeah, I may want to add that, of course, research funders supporting green open access, financing the infrastructure needed for that is one way. But as I mentioned earlier, in Europe, it's more common to also provide these funds separate from grant funds to support gold open access and to enable the transition to open access on a bigger scale. And that can take different shapes. Yeah? So for example, in the UK and another European country recently announced or is doing this right now as well, it's via block grants. So the funder basically dedicates certain money to the research performing organization, from which then the support goes to the authors. But there are other ways of doing it, and not the least also this multi-payer model, I think, addresses that point. And in Sweden, I believe there's also a particular scheme now decided where the consortium works with the funders and money is basically contributed to gold open access that way. So there are different ways how funders play a role in the future, hopefully.
Any thoughts or comments from the audience? Looks like no, so we'll go to the next question. And Frank mentioned this a little bit, which is, what do you think the multi-payer model, and maybe one of us could provide a little bit of a definition of what we mean by that, but what will that model look like in the next 3 to 5 years, not only in the US, but also globally as well?
Again, I think this goes to me. Yes, so yeah, multi-payer model, what do we mean with that? So the University of California wanted to have open access agreement with publishers, and we wanted to repurpose subscription funds to support open access publishing. But we had a problem. So we have 10 campuses and 2 national laboratories, and they published a lot. So most of the campuses are R1 institutions, very research intensive. and therefore there's tons of publications coming out of the UC system. And so much that our subscription money that the library had for a particular publisher is not enough to cover the anticipated number of publications and pay for it. So my colleagues at CDL and other working groups at the UC looked around and found out that authors pay for open access in addition to what we pay for subscription to a particular publisher. So there was some double dipping here. So the publisher cashed in on our subscription, and then authors paid additional money from research funds or other funds in order to publish open access. So we thought, why can't we combine these two streams and find a model that will incorporate both? So the multi-payer model works that way. That we have an agreement with a particular publisher, and UC affiliated corresponding authors, always the corresponding author, usually get automatically a $1,000, we called it subvention, but we turned the term now to contribution because nobody really knew what subvention was. Anyway, so they get $1,000 automatically, and then the author is asked, do you have research funding to pay the rest of it? And if you do, please do. And then you get an invoice from the publisher, you pay, and you're done. And if you don't have research funding, or this is not grant funded, or your grant is expired, and so on, then just tick a box, and we cover the whole thing as libraries. And this works pretty well, I have to say. There are also some agreements that are different, slightly different, so I don't want to go in the exceptions. But in general, it works well. We made projections how much in contributions from the authors we would need in order to make the system sustainable. And I think we are slightly above that. So authors do have research funding, and if they do, many of them are happy to contribute. And this enables us to cover the full APCs for authors who don't have much funding. So there's graduate students, disciplines that are not very well funded, projects that are not funded, and so on. So multi-payer meaning two payers, the library repurposing subscription money, and the authors contributing with research fund to the APCs.
Just really quick, to kind of back what Michael was mentioning there, the authors are willing to pay. And just a quick note, we sent out a survey just recently to all of our authors at IGI Global, and 50% of all the open access published individuals did pay out of pocket full amounts. So there is a willingness there to use their own funding in support of the multi-payer models.
I think the challenge of that is equity, right? To be able to get they can pay that out of their pocket, but to have something like a multi-payer model may provide some assistance for folks who may not have as much funding access.
Yeah, it does provide, yeah, of course, that's important to us. But I forgot one thing. A problem with that is, of course, that we don't have subscription money that we can use in order to pay for publications with full open access publishers. So with Frontiers, we talk quite a bit sometimes about, because our authors like publishing there, and we don't have subscription funds that we can repurpose. We can do this for Cambridge University Press and for Wiley and so on, but that causes a challenge, but we're working on that.
So that's exactly where I came in. Where are we at now for those publishers that are meeting the requirements that make that transformation? And I think that's what livens up this discussion. What are we doing? Where does this go?
Well, and I think you at a great time. We're at about 15 minutes left, so perhaps this is a good time to open this up to audience questions, comments, or feedback. So